Dave, this show does 1.25 million buys on April 1st, 2007, the most bought WWE show of all time. Why was it such a success?
Donald Trump and Vince McMahon's hair. And that's what it was. It was, Donald Trump was a big-time celebrity, and even though he couldn't do a wrestling match and he wasn't in the match, Donald Trump's hair is a topic of conversations. And Vince McMahon is Vince McMahon larger than life. I think if Donald and Vince was the main event in a hair match, I don't think it would have done that well because people would just go, it's whatever. Because Vince's big matches never did the giant business. But the idea of their hair at stake and let's face it, the two guys who were in that match, who were both being pushed at the time, the fact is that neither of them ever were in a stage like that again for the rest of their life. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the idea was absolutely to make Bobby Lashley, and Bobby Lashley was a Vince McMahon handpicked guy, and Umaga was, in a great wrestling family. I think Umaga was probably the best wrestler, bell to bell, of anyone in that family. I thought that guy was just tremendous. But, Umaga's job was to put Bobby Lashley over. And Donald Trump, the idea is what we're going to do with Donald Trump is he's going to endorse Bobby Lashley, so Bobby Lashley gets the win on a big stage, and then we go with Bobby Lashley as this big thing. So we get some benefit past the point we're going to do a big buy rate, but we're also going to make a new star off of this program. It all made perfect sense. But the idea that Vince was going to get his head shaved and because I don't think anyone really believed that Trump was going to lose. So Vince is going to get his head shaved, and probably by Austin, because Austin was the referee, and I think they kind of teased that. I think that there was, that was something really momentous. And it was they've had all kinds of big WrestleManias, and I'm not saying it's bigger than Hogan and Andre because it was a different time and there weren't as many homes with pay-per-view. But modern era-wise, it was the biggest that they ever got.
Certainly was. And to Lashley, and to our discussion last week about bodies and Vince McMahon's predilection for guys with impressive physiques, is that really all there is to what they saw in pushing Bobby Lashley this way? I mean, he flamed out pretty dramatically, though certainly a great athlete with a lot of cool attributes. Not much more going on, Dave, though, as far as depth as a potential main eventer than just the physique.
He had an incredible physique. I mean, he had of all the guys, if you think about it, except for maybe a young Tony Atlas and maybe not even him. I mean, Bobby Lashley just was so big and so cut. And John Cena, who had great physiques, I don't think that their physiques compared to Bobby Lashley. The problem with Bobby Lashley was that he was not a good promo, and as a wrestler, he was okay. For the length of time he had in the business when they pushed him, I actually think he was kind of good. But I remember the whole Bobby Lashley story. When the first time I saw Bobby Lashley on OVW television, Blaster Lashley, and he was just gigantic. I was just like, whoa, my God. And I remember talking to people there, and it was just like, and he was so green. I mean, he was so green, and they did a gimmick where he would only do 1-minute matches in OVW on television because he couldn't do anything else. He was so green. But boy, did he look, the physique was just incredible. And the whole thing was we got to hide this guy from Vince. We got to hide this guy from Vince. And I go, what are you talking about? He goes, Vince sees this guy. He's going to want him on the main roster tomorrow, and he's so green. He's not ready. So they hit him as long as they could, but then Vince saw him, and then Vince brought him up way too soon. And if you remember, so Vince puts him in there with, and they understand that he's not ready, so Vince puts him in there with Finlay, but he wants, and Finlay's the great on-the-job coach, player coach, great trainer. But, they want Finlay to get this guy ready to be Superman in 6 months. And it just, if it was Kurt Angle, it would have worked. But Bobby Lashley's not Kurt Angle. It's like everyone's different. I always wonder if Bobby Lashley wasn't so rushed, maybe it would have been different. But at the same time, I don't know that Bobby Lashley ever would have been a great promo. And that's so important in being a wrestler. And aside from the body, I don't know that Bobby Lashley has super charisma. He's a good athlete. He was a decent enough worker that he wasn't bad. But after the program here with the Trump match, Bobby was in a spotlight, and then afterwards they really tried to shoot him high. And I remember with Bobby Lashley had a match with John Cena on a pay-per-view. In fact, it was the first pay-per-view after the Chris Benoit thing. And they did really well, and it was also a hell of a match. So it was like it wasn't like Bobby was a failure, but then Bobby hurt his shoulder, and once he hurt his shoulder, he took time off for the bad shoulder, and they got really mad because we've invested so much in you, and why did you have surgery now? And their feeling was, I mean, look at what his body looked like. So therefore, how bad could it really be hurting? Well, it probably was hurting bad, but in their mind, you can gut your way through it. You can, and he at one point just goes, "I'm getting surgery," and when he got the surgery, I think that there was a lot of bad feelings, and he never came back because that was when he had the issue with Michael Hayes, and he wanted his release.
Absolutely. This show also sees a match that prompts a discussion point. It's not a particularly significant match on this show, but it gives me the opportunity to ask you about an interesting move WWE made around this point in time. It's the ECW Originals of Rob Van Dam, Tommy Dreamer, Sabu, and the Sandman facing the New Breed over on the ECW show that they had launched on Tuesday nights on Sci-Fi. Elijah Burke, Marcus Corvan, Matt Stryker, and Kevin Thorne. There's a few guys you probably haven't thought of in a while. They had in June 05, they did a pay-per-view called ECW One Night Stand in the true blue ECW aesthetic with all the original guys coming back, and they decided, Dave, to actually launch ECW as its own separate television show with its own separate roster. Tell the listeners, why was this brought back? It's so odd to watch this show and see this ECW storyline presented in the middle of the WWE program. Why the ECW idea and the resurrection?
The first one Night Stand was a gigantic success. The second one wasn't as big a success, but the first one, I don't think they were ready for it. I don't know that anyone was ready for it. I think that there was always the mentality that ECW had very, very fervent fans, but there weren't that many of them. And they made a lot of noise, and they were big on the internet, but there's just not that many of them. So they do One Night Stand, and it did so much better than they expected that it was such a successful show. I mean, the matches weren't necessarily the greatest, but as a show from start to finish, I thought it was one of the best pay-per-views I ever saw. I would put it up there, not match quality wise, but just as a one night show. It was incredible. I mean, the announcing, Joey Styles was just so great that night. And as I recall, he didn't even, they had to talk him into doing it. And it ended up they got him his WWE job, didn't it?
It did, and they handed the reins over to Paul Heyman to actually put the show together in the true spirit of things, and that made all the difference as well.
Well, if anyone else had done it, it would have been an absolute travesty.
As it went on to be.
Yeah, but even with Paul, and then after Paul, even more, right? So the next year, after that big success, and they didn't capitalize on it at all. I thought, like, after that ECW One Night Stand, I thought this thing is so hot, we're gonna, they need to, I thought they could have started the brand from that, but they weren't ready for it. And then they really pretended it never happened. I mean, I just thought the selling of ECW T-shirts would have been incredible, but it just, whatever it was, they weren't ready. They didn't follow up. So a year later, now they're ready. They do the One Night Stand again. It's not nearly as hot as the first year. Then they start the thing, and the original TV show at first the ratings were incredibly strong for the ECW TV show, but they collapsed so quickly, and it was just the whole thing of people wanted to see this thing, and it became, it went from ECW back to third-rate WWE brand Sunday Night Heat television. And with guys that, whatever, they didn't have the edge, they couldn't do what they did before, and it just was, and everyone could see it dying in front of your eyes, and that's never fun to watch. And that's what happened. It did, they went on tour, and they didn't really draw on tour, and they were on TV, and the TV shows weren't very good, and it wasn't authentic, and people had their idea, both romantic and just realistic, of what they thought ECW should be, and it was neither of those things. And it was if you were an ECW fan, it was actually painful to watch, and even if you weren't, you still had the feeling of, boy, this thing's flopping from very early on in the run.
We talked earlier about how successful the Money in the Bank ladder match was as part of the WrestleMania presentation. This year, WrestleMania 23, they put over Mr. Kennedy in the match, and there were big plans for this young talent, and Ken Anderson, and he would be much like Lashley in that, the writing was on the wall, that they were ready for a very significant push for this guy, and he hurts himself, and that's it. Can you talk about what seems to be a trend forming around this late 2000s period for the WWE where they decide on a guy and then just one faux pas later it's over?
Well, with Ken Anderson, I mean, there were a couple of things that happened with him. And I don't remember the exact order of all of them, but there was the one, and I mean, the one he got injured, and I think it was a tricep. I'm not positive if it's a tricep or a bicep, but I think it was a tricep. But he was told it was a tear and that he would be out for 6 months. So he was the Money in the Bank guy, and how do we get out of this? So they had Edge beat him in a match for the Money in the Bank, and then he was going to go and have his surgery, and then he was going to be gone, and that would happen. Comes to find out the injury was misdiagnosed, and he did have an injury, and he was out for a little while, but then he's back. And losing that, being the first guy to win Money in the Bank and not cash in, even though he didn't lose the match, it tagged him as kind of a failure. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that hurt. And then he had other injuries that slowed him down a lot. A few of the guys didn't like to work with him. He rubbed some people the wrong way. The thing with the Chris Benoit thing, he was an embarrassment to the company. There was he had asked in the wake of Chris Benoit, when the WWE's getting slammed in publicity wise, he asked, "Let me go on. I want to defend the company." Mm-hmm. So he goes on and about how the steroid testing is foolproof and this and this and this, and just really like, I don't do steroids. I did. I mean, he said I did, but I do not anymore. And it's impossible to beat these tests. And then, what was it? A month or two later, the Signature Pharmacy investigation comes in, and there's a list of 13 or so WWE guys that were doing steroids long after the testing began and were somehow beating the test. However, who knows? And there's Ken Anderson's name on that list after going on TV. And I think that really embarrassed the company, and he was never the same after that. They never looked at him the same. If you remember, there was a point where now I'm trying to remember how this happened. I don't remember if it was an injury, but what was the deal? Because he was going to get that one big push when he was going to be, he's going
to be a relative of Vince's. He was going to be
Vince McMahon's illegitimate son. He was going to be Ken Kennedy McMahon.
Right.
And he was going to be, and probably world champion. Mm-hmm. And what did he did something wrong right before, and they switched it to Hornswoggle, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it was.
Yeah, well, didn't he hurt Randy Orton? Did he concuss Randy Orton on Raw?
I think that was, I don't remember if that was before or later.
Yeah, but it was some kind of thing that wasn't evident to the viewing audience. It was backstage stuff, and suddenly this guy, no longer is a hand in the deck, and pretty soon he's gone altogether.
Yeah, well, what I remember is on the show, and I think this was the Stan Kroenke show, if that show.
Oh yeah, in Denver, yeah.
Where I think he came back from an injury, and he back suplexed Randy Orton on Randy Orton's bad shoulder, and Randy Orton flipped out on him, and then John Cena backed up Randy Orton, and they fired Ken Anderson for that. So that was his, being done in. But he had a couple of injuries. He had the Benoit thing, and there's whatever the thing was, and I can't remember off the top of my head, that caused him to be pulled from the Ken Kennedy McMahon role. Mm-hmm. And that's your story on a guy who, was going to be, he was going to be world champion, and then he was going to be, if you're Ken Kennedy McMahon, he was going to be, almost a Triple H.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It mentions here in his Wikipedia entry that the angle was written because Kennedy, being named one of the 11 superstars in the steroid scandal, was suspended for 30 days. They talk about how that's kind of the reason the name Kennedy was picked, because of course he came in as Anderson, and
Yeah.
they gave him Kennedy with this longer range idea of having him related to Vince.
Well, no, actually, that's not. They didn't have that originally. The Kennedy idea. The Kennedy idea was actually a genius idea of Paul Heyman to get, because Paul Heyman and Ken Anderson were very close from OVW, and Heyman, gave him the Mr. Anderson
right.
thing, which he still does to this day, and probably is the only reason he ever made it to the big roster, because that gimmick got over in everywhere it ever went, and they didn't want him, so he comes up, and his name is I guess Anderson. This is not during the period where everyone has to have a fake name. And so he was using the Ken Anderson name. I think that his real last name is Ken. God damn, what is it? But Anderson's his mother's name.
Oh.
But he for whatever reason, I don't think he got along with his father, and so he was always Ken Anderson. Like when he started wrestling, he was Ken Anderson. So he was always Ken Anderson. He was Ken Anderson developmental. And at that time, they weren't changing people's name. So he comes up to the main roster, Mr. Anderson. They liked him. They wanted to give him a push. And Vince McMahon just goes, "I hate Ole Anderson." That's it. You got to get a new name. I hate Ole Anderson.
There you go.
So it goes to Heyman. And they come up with these different ideas, and I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was Anderson or Heyman, and but it was a conversation between the two of them, and somehow they float around some name Kennedy, and the other, and Heyman goes, so it may have been Anderson, and but I'm not sure, but it just goes, "Oh my